This is the final attachment lesson before the summer. We're going to look at Bowlby's theory, and this is on paper 1 with memory, social and psychopathology. So what I want us to do today is look at Bowlby's theory. First of all, a bit of background behind Bowlby's theory. I want you to outline the theory of evolution. Which approach does evolution link to? And how can we link evolution to attachment? So think about those questions, maybe jot down a few answers. Okay, so you should have the idea that the theory of evolution links to adaptation and survival, and individuals who are better adapted are more likely to survive and therefore pass on their characteristics to their offspring. This is part of the biological approach in psychology, and if we think about how it links to attachments, if an infant is evolved to make an attachment and they have specific skills or behaviours that mean that they form an attachment to a caregiver, then these infants are more likely to survive because they have that attachment to the caregiver who provides them resources to enable them to survive. So Bowlby thought of a theory behind this, and he came up with something called the monotropic theory of attachment. This is the idea that infants have an innate tendency, so infants are born to form attachments to their primary caregiver. They have something within them, something biological, something evolutionary that makes them behave in a particular way, and therefore they form an attachment to a primary caregiver. This is often their mother, according to Bowlby, but if we think about that, it was done in the 50s, and in the 50s mothers were more likely to stay at home and fathers were more likely to go out to work, and nuclear families were common. There are 3 important aspects to his theory. So infants are programmed to become attached, so this is the idea that it's innate and it's biological. It takes place during a critical period, so we'll discuss that in a bit. So there's a specific period of time where an infant forms this attachment, and they must form this attachment, and if they don't, it can have an effect on their development. So that's kind of similar to the final point. Attachment plays a role in later development. So this is the idea that the attachment that you have as an infant affects your development throughout life, and it can also affect your future relationships and future attachments that you have with other people, and even that you have with your children. Because we saw in Harlow's monkeys that Harlow, the monkeys that didn't have that attachment, that affected them for the rest of their lives as well. So that's where Bowlby and Harlow kind of cross over a little bit. So the first part of this theory is monotropy. So Bowlby believed that infants attach to one caregiver, and this is a primary attachment figure. That's what we would call them in modern day, but Bowlby referred to them as a mother figure. He believed that this attachment was special, and the more time an infant spent with their primary attachment figure, the better they would develop. So this is known as a monotropic bond. So a monotropic bond is a special bond that an infant has with a primary attachment figure. Bowlby believed this to be a mother figure. He referred to it as a mother figure, but he didn't necessarily mean it had to be female, or it had to be their biological mother. But that's kind of been misinterpreted over the years. The other part to Bowlby's monotropic theory is that he had 2 laws. So the first was the law of continuity. So he said that the more constant and predictable the care that a child has, the better the quality of their attachment. So if that primary attachment figure is always there for them when they need them, picks them up when they cry, gives them care on a regular basis, and it's very predictable and they have a routine and it's better quality, then they're going to have a really good attachment. The next part is the law of accumulated separation. So this is basically when an infant is separated from a primary attachment figure, that has an effect on them. And the more they are separated, or the longer they are separated, the more of an effect that has on the development of that infant or that child. And this links to the theory of maternal deprivation that we'll look at after the summer when we come back to attachment. So just to summarise Bowlby's monotropic theory, it's a special bond between an infant and a primary attachment figure which Bowlby referred to as a mother figure. It's affected by continuity and basically consistency as well. So if your attachment is continuous and it's reliable and it's predictable, then you're going to have a better attachment between the infant and the primary attachment figure. And then separation, so the more often you are separated from that primary attachment figure, or the longer you are separated from that primary attachment figure, the more of an effect it has on your development or that child's development. The next part to Bowlby's monotropic theory is this idea of social releases. So Bowlby said that this attachment and this monotropic bond was something that's innate and it's something that's biological, so it's something that infants are driven to do, so they're driven to form an attachment. So he suggests that infants have these behaviours within them that encourage adults to care for them. So these are called social releases. So for example, a baby might cry, or they might coo, or they might smile, and they do all of these things and they look really cute, and these encourage adults to form attachments with them. So if we think back to learning theory, this could kind of explain that idea of, well, an infant has a social releaser, and that social releaser is the infant crying, and then the effects of that social releaser lead to the learning theory. So it could be that Bowlby's theory is actually behind the initial part of learning theory, and that's how the two link together. So social releases, examples are crying and cooing. They attract attention from the caregiver and they help form an attachment. And they're biological, they're innate. Then Bowlby said about a critical period. He suggested that infants had to form an attachment within a critical period. This is birth to 2.5 years. And if an attachment didn't form within this period of time, it could cause the infant to have developmental issues, and they might struggle to form attachments in the future. And this again links into his theory of maternal deprivation, which we'll look at in the future. Bowlby also readjusted his theory, and he actually proposed a sensitive period. So it would have the most effects between the critical period, but if separation occurred up to 5 years, then this could also have negative effects on development. So he kind of extended that critical period a little, but he renamed it as a sensitive period. The critical period is more important, but up to 5 years it could have a little bit of an effect on that infant. So that's the critical period, which is birth to 2.5 years. Sorry, that says 2, it should say 2.5 years. The sensitive period is up to 5 years, and if separation occurs in this time from the infant and the primary attachment figure, it can have negative effects on their development. This could be their social, emotional development. Sometimes it could be their physical development also, and it could also be the development of future relationships and future attachments to other people and to their own infants. So if we think about Harlow's monkeys, that links into the critical period too, because Harlow found that if monkeys were returned to their peer group before 3 months, then they would develop better than if they were returned to their peers after 6 months. So this is the idea that monkeys might have a different critical period, but a critical period could also exist for them. Then we've got this idea of the internal working model. So this is another part of Bowlby's monotropic theory. He said that this monotropic bond that an infant has when they form an attachment helps them develop relationships in the future, because it forms something called an internal working model. And an internal working model is kind of a bit like a schema. So it's a schema that a child has that helps them understand how they should form relationships. So if a child has a caring parent or primary attachment figure when they're an infant, and whenever they cry they get cuddles, and they help them when they're hurt, and they teach them how to be nice to other people and all of that kind of stuff, then when that infant grows up to be an adult, they will also have that same relationship with other people, so their partners, they would have that similar relationship. They would care for them. They would always be there for them when they hurt themselves. They would look after them, all of that kind of stuff. And then when they have their own babies, they would behave in the same way. So the attachment that you have as a child affects you for the rest of your life, and it affects your adult relationships, and that's called the continuity hypothesis. So it works the other way as well. So if an infant has a negative experience as a child, they've been separated from their maternal figure, they haven't had a reliable care, they haven't had someone who's always there for them, then when they have a relationship, they would potentially behave in a similar way, and that can be a relationship with another person, or it could be a relationship with their own infants. So later on, further on in attachment, the last topic that we look at is early attachment and adult relationships, and that comes back to Bowlby's continuity hypothesis. So there's some research that I'll discuss as research support that we actually look at in that final part of attachment that you can actually bring back to this idea of the internal working model. So you need to be aware that monotropy and the monotropic theory and this idea of internal working model and the critical period, you can link it to other areas in attachment, and you can use it to evaluate other areas in attachment, or you can use other areas in attachment to evaluate this theory. It's kind of a more holistic approach, so when you've learned it all, you can link it back. The internal working model. This is a model of relationships. It forms through the monotropic bond with your primary attachment figure, and it continues for the rest of your life. So if you have a good attachment and a good internal working model as an infant, then you're going to have good attachments as an adult and with your own infants. So to summarise the monotropic theory, you could use an acronym. So I've used MICS. So monotropy, internal working model, critical period, social releases. So when you get a question like a 16 marker about Bowlby's monotropic theory, these are the things that you should be talking about. And if you can remember it using an accurate acronym, that should help. So now we've got some evaluations of the theory. The first one is limitations of the theory. So it's not necessarily very valid. So if we think about if it's truthful and it applies to all situations, that doesn't occur. So Schaefer and Emerson found that some babies in their study of Glasgow infants that we looked at previously, they actually had multiple attachments at the same time. So they would have attachments to more than one individual, and this therefore suggests that there isn't necessarily a particular monotropic bond where they have a preferred primary attachment figure, and this attachment is stronger. Obviously Schaefer and Emerson didn't investigate the quality of attachments, they just investigated the number of attachments. They didn't go into lots of detail, and that was a criticism, to say they didn't look at whether one attachment was more important than other attachments. So although we're saying it lacks validity because we're using Schaefer and Emerson to go against it, Schaefer and Emerson isn't necessarily as reliable, and the research that they gathered didn't necessarily look at monotropy. So you've got to be careful when you're using that to question the validity, and you can sort of put that as a counter argument. Then we have this idea of social sensitivity. So this is the idea that Bowlby's monotropic theory, initially, because it was done in the 1950s and he used terms like mother figure, it was assumed that the mother was the primary attachment figure and the mother was that important person for that child. Because of that interpretation, it means that it could put pressure on mothers. So if a mother decided to return to work, people could view that in a negative way, because we know from Bowlby's theory that the more separation or longer the periods of separation between a mother and an infant, if we're using people's interpretation of this theory, then the more detrimental effect that's going to have on that child's development. So if a mother returns to work, they could feel guilty, or they could be judged by others, because it could affect their child's development. And also, if children have attachment issues as adults, or they have problems attaching to their peers as teenagers or children, then the adults or the parents, caregivers of that child, could feel as if it's their fault, because the theory suggests that your future attachments are based on the attachment that you have as an infant. So that's a problem there, that's an issue. When we look at early attachment, and adult attachment, there's some theories also, that some evidence that goes against this continuity hypothesis and suggests that our attachments actually change across our lifetime. So you could use that again to go against this part of Bowlby's theory if you wish, so you can link it to evaluation points that we use in later lessons. Then we've got some strengths of the theory. So this is mainly based on research support. So we've got Bailey et al., who looked at attachment between mothers and their 1-year-old babies, and they found that if a mother had a poor attachment to their primary caregiver, they were more likely to have poorly attached babies. So they asked them questions about their attachments that they had as a child, and they applied that to, they linked that to the attachments that they had with their babies. So that supports the internal working model. You can also use Hazan and Shaver, which we'll look at in early attachment and adult relationships, and that's something similar. So this is something called a love quiz, and what they did was they gave a questionnaire to individuals, and it was in a newspaper, and this questionnaire could be divided into sections, and there were questions about an individual's attachment to their parents, attachment to their partners, and their perception of things like love. And they found that an individual who had a poor attachment as a child was more likely to not believe in love at first sight, and they were also more likely to be divorced, whereas an infant who had a secure attachment, so a good attachment, when they were infants, to their parents, they were more likely to believe in love at first sight, and they were also less likely to be divorced. So that shows some continuity of their attachments over time. When I say a good attachment and a bad attachment, we'll look at that in the next lesson when we look at the strange situation. A secure attachment is seen as a good attachment in Western society, but we'll discuss the issues with that later. So you can use Hazan and Shaver, which we'll learn at the end of attachment, and you can bring that back and you can use that to support Bowlby's theory of internal working model and continuity hypothesis. So to summarise our evaluation, we've got issues with validity because Schaefer and Emerson found research that opposed it because infants have multiple attachments, and also there's ethical concerns with regards to social sensitivity and judging mothers who return to work. A good thing though, we've got internal research support for the internal working model, and you can use Hazan and Shaver for that, you can use Bailey for that, and I do know that in the textbook there's support for social releases as well, so you can add that in if you like. I'm just concerned about giving you too much evaluation, because you don't need, it's more quality over quantity that's important in terms of your evaluation for longer mark questions. So just to finish, have a go at this 6-mark question. So outline Bowlby's theory of attachment. Try and write it as a P paragraph. So I've got some starters there, some prompts to help you with that. So I'd like you to have a little go at that question. I'll show you what we've got for the mark scheme. So this is something similar, that if you've got something similar to this, then you could get full marks. So it suggests that attachment is important for survival. It's an evolutionary theory. They're innately programmed. It's biological. There's a critical period, social releases. there's an internal working model, and it's the idea of monotropy. You don't need to include all of those parts for a full mark answer. You could just have 2 or 3 of those parts explained really well, and that would be fine. If you want me to check it, put a comment at the end of your assignment when you hand it in, and I'll have a look at that. So I hope you have a nice summer, and I hope to see you back in the classroom in September. If not, I'll continue with these videos. Thank you very much.